Okay, so Texas comes online as a cotton economy. There's other crops grown in Texas, of course. There's wheat, corn, sugar. Texans have to eat. But the big and the most valuable crop is cotton by far. But what happens is the Texas economy becomes dependent on cotton for its success. And if you're a nation, you never want to be dependent on one commodity. Why is that? Because prices fluctuate. Think about the price of oil. It was just a couple of years ago, what were we paying for gas? 250, something like that. Now we're paying 175. So think about even in your lifetime, the fluctuations in the price of oil and the price of gasoline. Exxon lost $1 billion last year. The big giant energy corporation, not last year. Yeah, I think last year. So the point is that prices fluctuate. They don't always go up. You do have these boom times, and Texas did become an independent nation when cotton was booming and the price of cotton was really high, which was very significant and very lucky for Texas. But within just a couple of years, there was an overproduction of cotton, and then the price of cotton collapsed. There was a depression in the United States, which came across the Sabine into Texas. So, long story short, cotton was a two-edged sword for Texas. It was a commodity that was highly valued, but sometimes the price of cotton would just collapse. And when it collapsed, Texas didn't have a lot else to go on. So the fact that Texas was basically the economy of Texas was focused on cotton meant it was very vulnerable to when the prices of cotton collapsed, which they did in the 1830s. So I want to go back to Santa Anna for a second. So Santa Anna's captured, and Santa Anna, his whole thing is he wants to save his own skin. I think that's fair to say. So the Texas Army wants to kill Santa Anna because of what had happened at Goliad and the Alamo. But for the Texas government, Santa Anna was worth much more alive than he was dead, because remember, he's still president of Mexico. So Santa Anna signs two treaties with Sam Houston, one secret and one is public. But the secret one I want to talk about, the Treaty of Alaska. It's the secret treaty. He signed, they were both Treaty of Alaska, but one was made public, the other was secret. And in the secret one, Santa Anna promised that he would withdraw his troops south of the Rio Grande, which is what happened. I talked about that at the end of a couple of weeks ago. How the Mexican army left Mexico at Santa Anna's orders, even though it could have stayed and perhaps even defeated the Texans. But the thing also is that Santa Anna promised that he would work with the Mexican government to recognize the independence of Texas. And this is a really key point. Mexico did not ever recognize the independence of Texas until the Mexican-American War of 1848. In the period that Texas was a republic, Mexico always claimed that Texas was still part of Mexico, that it was a rogue part of Mexico. And this caused real problems for Texas because in Europe, European diplomats, when they looked at Texas, they often didn't see an independent country. What they saw was an area of Mexico that was still at war with Mexico. Now, this would change because Europeans wanted Texas cotton, and eventually European nations would recognize Texas. But the fact that Mexico is still claiming that Texas is part of Mexico was one of the things that caused the Republic of Texas, what caused it to have a number of headaches, this question of whether or not Texas was an independent country or not. So the key point is Santa Anna orders the Mexican army out of Texas. He basically recognizes the independence of Texas, but the Mexican government absolutely refuses to abide by the articles of the treaties that Santa Anna signs. They say that Santa Anna signed him as a prisoner, that he wasn't free. He was under duress. He was forced to sign these treaties. So what you have after 1836, and again, this is something that's often forgotten, you have a stalemate between Mexico and Texas. And one of the few things that united Mexicans were fighting each other continually, but one of the few things that united Mexicans, all Mexicans really, was this idea of reconquista, that Mexico would somehow come up back into Texas and recapture Texas and bring it back into the Mexican nation. Now, of course, this never happened. But you do have some invasions of Texas by the Mexican army in the 1840s. So Mexico isn't ready to let go of Texas yet. And this is a big headache for the Republic of Texas. Okay, so let's shift our focus to Washington now, Washington, D.C. So Texas has gained its independence from Mexico, at least it claims it's independent from Mexico. And Sam Houston, the hero of San Jacinto, is elected the first president of Texas. And the priority number one for Sam Houston was to get or persuade the United States to annex Texas as a state in the United States. So Sam Houston and the vast majority of Anglos that dominated Texas during this period, they did not want to be an independent country. This is really the key point. They wanted the U.S. to annex Texas ASAP, as soon as possible. Texans wanted to be part of the United States. So Houston sends up diplomats to Washington. By the way, it's during this period that Stephen F. Austin is appointed Secretary of State, but he dies in December of 1836, kind of really a tragic figure. By the time he died. He dies kind of a miserable death. But Houston sends up representatives to Washington, and they meet with Andrew Jackson, who supposedly was Sam Houston's mentor. Well, he was his mentor. But there were a lot of folks that thought that Andrew Jackson had sent Houston into Texas to break Texas from Mexico in order to become part of the United States. So the Texas diplomats were really surprised when Jackson refuses to annex Texas into the United States. Why did Jackson initially refuse to annex Texas in the United States? There are a couple of reasons. First of all, Mexico. Jackson did not want a war with Mexico, and he knew that if the U.S. moved quickly to annex Texas into the U.S., Mexico would declare war on the United States, and he just didn't want a war with Mexico. Now, the war with Mexico is going to come, but it doesn't happen for another 10 years or so, and it happens under a different president. But initially, Andrew Jackson doesn't want a war with Mexico. Probably just as important is the abolition question. During this period, you do have in the U.S. North a rising tide of voices. It's never a majority of white Northerners, but it's a loud minority who are really opposed to slavery. And they don't want a new slave state in the United States. And many folks in the North thought that the whole independence of Texas stunk to high heaven. That it was a plot. It was a plot by the slave South to bring in another slave state into the United States. And they just absolutely did not want that. And so what happens is that Texas becomes caught up in the growing fight between pro-slavery Southerners and anti-slavery Northerners about the future of the United States. Would the U.S. would it be a slave nation, or would it be a nation of workers who received wages, pretty lousy wages in many cases, but nonetheless they're not slaves? So again, Texas becomes independent at kind of an awkward moment because there's this big fight in the U.S., or it's a fight that's brewing, but we're only 30 years away from the Civil War, actually a little less. So Texas, the Republic of Texas, gets caught up in the dispute in the United States over slave states versus free states. And the free states where there was no slavery, they just had no desire at this point to bring in another state. And everybody knew that Texas would be a slave state when it came into the Union. There was just no doubt about it. I mean, just look at the map. And there were already slaves in Texas anyway. So Houston's initial foray into Washington, his attempt to have Washington, the United States, annex Texas very, very quickly after the Texas Revolution, was a failure. He did get a fig leaf from Jackson, though. He didn't get annexation, but he got recognition. The day before Andrew Jackson left office, he diplomatically recognized Texas. The United States recognized Texas as an independent nation. The US sent a diplomat to Texas. Now, this was a big deal. It wasn't annexation, which is what most Texans wanted, but at least Houston got from Jackson the fact that the United States recognized the independence of Texas. This is very, very significant because remember, Mexico's still claiming that Texas is part of Mexico. So, but no, Jackson waits to do it until the day before he leaves office because he doesn't want the headache of the repercussions of this move. So what Texas gets after the revolution, they're not annexed into the United States. Texas is not annexed into the US. That's going to happen 10 years later. But the US government, Andrew Jackson, does recognize Texas as an independent nation in the family of nations. And this was a very, very significant move. It was short of annexation, but recognition was no small thing because it allowed Texans, for instance, to get loans from US banks in ways that they couldn't have before. It allowed Texas to claim, yes, we are an independent nation because the United States has recognized us as an independent nation. So annexation, no. Recognition, yes.